Good morning and a very warm welcome to this Place to Be's webinar, and we're going to be thinking together about anxiety. Okay, so obviously as a group of parents you're going to be thinking about your child and how you can support them through uncertain times, and it's probably a truism to say that actually there's going to be many uncertain times in your child or your children's lives. So hopefully what we talk about and think about together this morning is going to be useful at other times too. Just to say that I'll go through the presentation that I prepared for you this morning, but please do ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat below, and we should have some time at the end to address those. Okay, so what we're going to be thinking about this morning is what is anxiety? What do we mean when we talk about and think about anxiety? And we're going to be thinking about children and young people in particular, how they can be vulnerable to anxiety. And very importantly, how you as parents can support your child through these uncertain times. Just to say that I'm going to use the word parent throughout, but I appreciate some of you will be carers, some of you might be special guardians, kinship carers and so on. So that's my kind of shorthand term, just for anybody who's parenting or looking after a child or children. Okay, I guess the first thing that we need to think about is that anxiety is universal. It's completely normal and ordinary. I think sometimes we get this idea in our minds that somehow anxiety is a bad thing. We need to try and get rid of anxiety or manage it away. But actually it's just a normal everyday emotion. And it's one of those kind of cradle to the grave emotions, you know, that whether we're very, very young or very, very old, we will all experience different times in our lives, in the year, in the day even, when we feel a certain degree of anxiety. So it's very normal, it's very everyday. There'll be parts of today where you feel more anxious than others. And it's an emotion that we experience when we're under threat. Now, something else that's really important is that the brain works in very sometimes mysterious ways, because the threat doesn't have to be real. The threat is something that can reside within our minds. And we kind of know this intuitively because a lot of us will get anxious about something that's going to happen in the future. So that's not, in a way, if you like, a real threat because it's yet to come to fruition. We haven't actually experienced it. Sometimes we feel anxiety about something that's happened in the past. Okay, so whilst that's not imagined per se, but we can conjure up an image or an experience that we've had that created and caused some anxiety within us, and we can immediately feel the anxiety arise within us. So I think this is really important to keep in mind when we think about children in particular, because sometimes we can be tempted to kind of reassure away the anxiety, almost to kind of belittle it, like, oh, it's not real, you know, that's nothing to worry about. But anxiety sometimes arises not from what's real, what really is a threat, but often from what's imagined, what we imagine could be a threat. And that is the brain and the mind absolutely doing its job. Okay, so there's nothing pathological about that at all. So, you know, just to acknowledge as well that a lot of us, adults, children, doesn't matter what sort of work that we do, how old we are, what sort of life experience we've had, it's likely that we'll be experiencing increased anxiety at the moment. So this year, I'm sure in your family, in many families right across the globe, there's been real ups and downs. There's been moments of anxiety, there's been moments of low mood, there's been moments of joy and togetherness. So I think there's something about having a real sort of appreciation that all those aspects of us as human beings, all that, you know, our emotional lives are completely valid. And actually, anxiety has a really important protective function. So if we think about the fact that it's something that arises within us when we feel a threat, actually anxiety there is to help, its main function is to help keep us safe. So again, just to emphasize that if you recognize your child, or if you think about back into your own childhood, there's parts of anxiety that are completely ordinary and completely to be expected. And again, it's about keeping us either physically or psychologically safe. So in babies and in infancy, if you try and hand your baby to a stranger, it's likely that they'll protest, they'll get anxious, they'll reach out for you. And again, that's about the brain, the mind saying, whoa, this isn't mummy or daddy, this isn't my foster carer, this isn't the person that should be there. And so they protest, they get anxious, completely ordinary. That's about keeping you close to your main caregiver. Things like loud noises. If you're a baby or an infant, you don't know what that loud noise is. You'll have an instant anxiety response to it without being able to think, oh, that was just the bedroom door slamming. In early childhood, again, separation anxiety. So as you go off to nursery, as you go off to school, it's very ordinary that you'll feel some level of anxiety when you separate from your caregivers. Monsters, so fantasy things in the cupboard, dressing gowns on the door and at the end of the bed, morphing their way into sort of being big monsters in the night, that sort of thing, completely ordinary. In middle childhood, children become quite aware, probably a lot earlier than we realise, about real world dangers. So things like fires, people dying, news events, and certainly your primary age children will actually know quite a lot about coronavirus and restrictions and what's going on in the world generally. New challenges, going back to school when there's restrictions and bubbles and rules and so on. Fear of not getting it right, so start to get a bit of, not doing well in tests at school, that sort of thing. And teasing and bullying. Primary age children can start to become quite anxious about those aspects of life. And that kind of grows with adolescence as well. So, in adolescence, our main function is to separate from our parents. So our peer groups become increasingly important. So we become anxious about our social status. Am I popular? Am I not? Social groups, which group am I in? What groups am I excluded from? Pecking order and performance anxiety. I mean, my goodness, the stresses and strains of doing well at school are incredibly high at the moment. The stresses of getting into the right university or getting onto the college course that you wanted, or applying for jobs, especially in the current circumstances where all these places seem to be even more precious. Whilst, if you're parenting a child who's going and experiencing a lot of anxiety, it can be very challenging. At the same time, I want to reassure you that it's quite ordinary and part of a child's development too. So the main function of anxiety is to keep us safe. Remember, anxiety is a response to, oh, there's a threat somewhere here. And that threat can be to our physical existence, but also to our psychological existence. So we needed, and we continue to need, to be a little bit anxious actually in order to follow government guidelines and so on. We need to, it's interesting, before you joined us as participants, my colleague and I were just talking and we were saying, oh yeah, got to remember to take our masks out and so on. To a certain extent, you need to be a little bit anxious to remember to do that. You need to remember to take your hand sanitizer with you, to keep your 2 meter distance and so on. So, raised anxiety levels kind of help to keep us safe, help to keep us aware, especially at the moment. And in your children and your young people, anxiety can kind of show up in many forms. Sometimes it's really obvious that your child is anxious, But anxiety, again, has a bit of a sneaky way of kind of hiding behind other sorts of behaviours. So it might be that as we go through this list, you think, yeah, I hadn't thought of that as a kind of anxious response. So whenever your child presents in a certain way, especially in terms of the behaviour that you actually find quite challenging and difficult, if you find the chance to get a bit of space to think, okay, what's driving this behaviour? What sort of emotion might be going on for my child? And if it's kind of from fear or anxiety, it's really important to kind of get beneath the behaviour and actually help them cope with that feeling of threat, that anxiety response that they're having. So difficulties concentrating, it can be really tricky. And I think especially this year when we're out of rhythm of attending school, you know, certainly unless you were some sort of superhero, you know, they wouldn't have got the full school experience whilst you were trying to homeschool them and work and do everything else that you had to do. So I imagine a lot of children are having even more difficulties concentrating, both at school at the moment and at home for homework activities and so on. Because when your mind is preoccupied with keeping safe and feeling anxious, it's difficult to get on with cognitive tasks like school learning and home learning. Poor sleeping and having bad dreams, certainly anxiety can creep in. And again, we kind of know this. If any of you have ever had something on your mind, you can wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and it's immediately something that you start to go round and round. We have that kind of rumination where we go over our worries, and it's the same for children. They can creep in at those times at night. Changes to eating patterns, so maybe your child starts to undereat or overeat or kind of go for comfort foods. And irritable and quick to anger, so that kind of short fuse response in your child, it could be that actually they're anxious. Worry, negative thoughts, frequent checking. So if your child is sort of checking in with you, you know, what time are we leaving for that? Have we got everything that we need and so on? That's often worry taking over and driving that sort of conversation and that sort of behaviour. Tense, fidgety, using the toilet often. So anxiety can show up in how we, in our bodies and how our bodies respond. Frequent crying and being clingy. So again, that's that kind of separation, the fear of being by themselves or with someone else. They'd rather stay close to you. Tummy aches, headaches, feeling unwell. Again, that's often anxiety showing up in the body. And wanting to avoid certain people, certain places or certain things. That's one to keep a real eye on if you've seen a change in your child's pattern of behaviour around that. And as I said at the top of this slide, anything that you find challenging, you know, when your child really starts to sort of, you know, stretch your patience, if you get a chance, perhaps at the end of the day when they're in bed or talking to your partner or friends, family members, about, I wonder if anxiety is driving this behaviour. That can be a really useful question to ask yourself. Okay. There are 4 main aspects of anxiety, and the previous slide kind of touched on some of these. So they're the emotional aspects of anxiety. So this is the kind of, yes, we have sort of worry and those sorts of, you know, maybe feelings of dread, those sorts of feelings. But also worry can show up disguised as anger or irritability or feeling cross. So again, keep those in mind. If you think, oh yeah, my child's got sort of anger management issues, they can't control their anger, it can be useful to kind of reframe that and just kind of think as to whether that actually is anxiety driven. Physical, this is where anxiety shows up in our body. This is where we might start to sweat, where our hearts might beat more quickly, our blood pressure might increase, cortisol, adrenaline surges. You know, sometimes children experience it as kind of feeling quite jangly, quite on edge. Cognitive aspects of anxiety, these are the thoughts that race through our mind. These are the thoughts of, I can't do this, I don't want this, when's this all going to be over? you know, those thoughts that just come in every now and again. And then how we behave in response to all of that. You know, we might stop going out, or we might, I don't know, want to flout the rules, or we might find it difficult in terms of your children. They might find it difficult to separate from you in the mornings, or they might shout at you a lot more. All of these are aspects of anxiety, and what can be useful is when we know that, when we break anxiety down into those 4 aspects, that can give us clues as to ways in. So for example, especially maybe with older children and teenagers, they might be able to talk to you about their cognitions, about their thoughts, you know, that they've constantly got a really unhelpful thought running through their mind. Anticipatory anxiety might show up like, oh, I just know I'm not going to do well at school this year. There's no way I'm going to get my GCSEs. How am I meant to do my A levels in the current climate? You know, those sorts of things. So that can give you an idea about, okay, for my child, it shows up in terms of their cognitions, their thoughts. But also, you know, it can turn up physically. So we can address anxiety in a physical way. So if your child is experiencing a kind of very tense response in their body, they're sweaty, they're hot, and increased heart rate and so on, you know, you can encourage them to put their hand on their heart, to recognize that this is anxiety showing up in their body, and you can do something together to help regulate that anxiety. And we're going to talk about those strategies in a moment. So what can we do about all of this? I would say the first thing we always need to think about when we think about the children and young people around us, I'm talking to you as parents, but I say this to teachers as well, but number one is that children learn about the world, about themselves, about how to respond to what's going on through the messages that they get from you. That's not to say that they'll always respond in exactly the same way as you, but they do pick up, okay, this is how we do emotion in our house. Okay, so it won't necessarily be conscious, but unconsciously we pick up from our parents, from our carers, from our teachers, what life means, what you know, especially at the moment, what coronavirus means to us all, and how we respond. Yeah. Just the same as we build up these family scripts, don't we? So you'll have an idea of this is how we do birthdays in our family or not, or this is how we do Christmas, if you celebrate Christmas or not, or this is how we do holidays in our family, or this is how we have those kind of family script. Children learn from you. So the most important thing we can do is try and be a good role model. Now, being a good role model isn't about getting it right. In fact, I'd say it's really helpful for children to have parents and carers and teachers and so on around them who are just self-aware. So it could be that you describe yourself as quite an anxious person. That's absolutely fine. I think that self-awareness to say, yeah, I know I tend to get anxious is so helpful, because you're recognizing the emotion and you're labeling it. And they're the two kind of first things that you need to do to then be able to kind of regulate that emotion when it's sort of outlived its purpose, when it's outlived its function. Because anxiety goes on overdrive. It always works really, really hard, anxiety. It kind of over-responds, if you like. So sometimes we need to invite it to chill and take a bit of a back seat. So here's an example of a parent. Now, again, I chose this illustration because this looks like this parent's getting really cross. They're getting really mad and they're showing that through road rage. But if I was working with this family, I'd be really interested to find out about whether this parent actually feels quite anxious about getting the kids to school on time, if indeed this is where this parent is driving their children. So perhaps they're getting very anxious, they're getting very overwhelmed in the morning, perhaps it's quite chaotic in the morning trying to get the kids out and so on. So what happens is, as soon as there is any frustration in terms of, you know, extra roadworks or red lights all the way to school and so on, it comes out, their anxiety comes out as anger. So what they're teaching the children is, rather than labeling, okay, listen, I get anxious in the morning, we're going to nail our morning routine And that means that mummy or daddy won't get quite so anxious, and we're going to leave a bit earlier, and so on. Instead of doing that, this parent is teaching their children that when things don't go according to plan, we get angry about it and we act out to others. Okay, so it's absolutely fine that you're anxious, and it can be really useful for children to know that. Yeah, I get anxious too. Perhaps at work you could say, I've got a presentation coming up, or I've got an interview coming up, or I've got a client that I'm working with that I find challenging, and I feel anxious. And then you tell them what you do to help calm and regulate and soothe that anxiety. Such a useful life lesson you'll be giving them if you do that. So that's about kind of taking responsibility, owning your own anxiety, being all right with it, and then helping your child to recognise and understand their anxiety. Now that's probably really important, especially for your child who tends to act out their anxiety. So they might present as quite angry, a bit belligerent, very rejecting and hostile. Actually, that child is often quite fearful and quite anxious if you take the time to kind of peel back those layers. And one thing that can be useful to do to help your child recognise and understand their anxiety is to share with them this. So talk to them about their emotional responses. You know, can they put words to how they're feeling? You know, and unpack that a little bit. You know, if they say, yeah, well, I'm just angry, I'm just peed off, you know, that sort of stuff. Actually stay with that and unpack it a little bit more, because often they feel quite sad, quite fearful, quite worried. They might lack confidence and so on. Talk to them about how anxiety shows up in their body in physical ways. Talk to them about racing thoughts. For some children, that's such a relief. They might think they're the only person who has these awful racing thoughts that are really unhelpful and quite intrusive. And you say, no, sure, we all have them. Share some of your own, if that feels appropriate. And then how they go on to behave when they're anxious. That can be really useful feedback for them as well. Okay, and there is something about helping your child to feel safe as well. And just remind them that everyone is doing their very best at the moment, including you, to keep them safe, to keep your wider family safe, and that is just an ordinary part of what you would ordinarily do. So I think at the moment, what children might not appreciate is that you do this stuff all the time, but perhaps they just haven't recognised it up until now, because the threat is so obvious at the moment, isn't it? You know, so it feels like there's a big step up, whereas in fact you've always done everything to keep your child safe. And there is something about this time will pass. I found it really moving. There was a news piece about someone, I think she's called, forgive me if I get her name wrong, is it Granny Nancy? There's a wonderful woman who's 107 in Ireland, and she's actually written a letter, and really she's been through an awful lot in her life. But the message that I got when I sort of read it through is that this time will pass. You can survive all sorts of difficulty as long as you reach out and get the support that you need. So things don't stay the same. Even, in fact, this year we've seen, you know, things change quite a lot, haven't we? But when you're young, it can be incredibly difficult to think that things can change, and that times will pass, and that things will get better eventually, but there might be some ups and downs along the way. Certainly, if your child's very anxious, this might pertain more to teenagers. Do think about your own access to the news, and whether you could talk to your teenager about actually limiting their access to the news, especially if it's not a reputable news source. There's lots of conspiracy theories and so on out there. If you actually watch your mood as you watch the news or listen to the news, just watch and monitor your mood. Sometimes it can be useful to give yourself, perhaps on a scale, or your child on a scale of 0 to 10, how anxious you're feeling, or how, you know, what your mood is like generally in terms of low mood, you know. And certainly I did that with myself the other night. I was watching the news, and actually I felt my mood plummet. And I thought, okay, psychologist, heal yourself, turn off the news. Once I've got the main headlines, There's no need to kind of have this constant feed of how difficult it is, how anxiety provoking it is, how limiting life is at the moment. I kind of know that and I'm living with that, but actually, you know, putting a limit on that can be really useful. So think about that for yourself and for your children too. And remind yourself and your children that there are things we don't necessarily have control over, but we might have choice over. There's always a certain amount of choice. So even when we were in full lockdown, a lot of us probably felt really quite out of control. And we had controls imposed upon us. However, we still had choices about how we coped with that lockdown. So sometimes, and other restrictions, so sometimes it could be really useful to bring that to mind with your child to say, okay, even though we've got to stay in or make sure we're in by 10 o'clock, or, you know, we can't mix in more than other households if we're in London or whatever, you know, there's different regional restrictions. Let's focus on what we can make choices about. Now, these are really good for in terms of your mental health and reducing anxiety. So getting in touch with things that you can still choose to do that make you feel good. So you can still choose to listen to your favourite music. You can still choose to read a book or a poem that makes you feel good. You can still choose to engage with learning, learn a new skill, or schoolwork, or do a DIY project, or do something online. We've still got active choice about that. And we can still choose to connect and stay connected with others, or in fact reach out to others. Okay, so that's sort of quite subtle. We're not in control, but we do still have choice. And that can give us a kind of psychological freedom, even perhaps when we don't have the physical freedoms that perhaps we would really like to get back to. Definitely, this is a real, this is so great and so immediate, and this taps right into those, how anxiety shows up in our body. Because if you practice anxiety reduction techniques together, you're modeling, you're you know, showing your child this is how we can do things, this is how we can manage, these are the choices we can make when we feel anxiety arising in our minds, in terms of our thoughts, in terms of our bodies, we start to feel tense, in terms of our emotions, we start to feel angry, and in terms of our behaviour, we start pacing or sending messages or whatever, arguing, whatever it is we can do. One of the quickest things we can do to help reduce all of that is go out for a run, or for a walk, or for a cycle ride, whatever it is, do something physical. Because anxiety is about activation, okay? It's there to keep us safe, so our bodies get active. But what do we do with all that adrenaline and cortisol? We've got to get out on the trampoline and bounce it off, walk it off, run it off, do something physical. Plus, it gives you lovely time with your child, and even your teenagers who appear to want nothing to do with you actually really value time with their parents. All the kind of surveys that are done with teenagers says that they still really value you and having time with you. So walk the dog together, go out to the shops together, go for a run, go for a walk, whatever it is. That can be a great way of managing your anxiety. And you can model it yourself. You say, oh, I feel really tense, right, I'm going out for a run, get your trainers on, come and join me, or come on, let's get the dog, or whatever it is. And I'll certainly be doing that after I've done this webinar. I'll make sure I get a little bit of a break so I can see some sunshine outside. And there's a picture there of, okay, if that's not for you, what about find some mindfulness or a yoga app? There's so much online that you can just do together to say, you know what, I'm feeling so stressed, I just need to chill. And here are good ways to chill. Again, that modelling of this is how we do it, because we can all fall into unhealthy ways of getting us to a chilled state. So if we can model healthy ways of doing that with our children, they'll learn. This is a way to get a bit more relaxed, a bit more calm, bring the heart rate down, blood pressure down, and so on, and feel like things are racing less in our minds. And helping our child to face their fears. And I think especially if your child's getting very anxious about perhaps going outside or coming to the supermarket with you or attending school, it can be very tempting to want to kind of protect them from all of that and to say, okay, well, we don't have to do it. And I'm not saying to push or expose your child to very frightening events at all, but step by step, reassure them that they can do this with your help and that they're very brave for giving things a go. So if your child is finding it difficult to separate from you or to do things that they ordinarily would have done, perhaps play at a friend's house or, as I say, going to school, encourage them to continue to do those things. Acknowledge the anxiety, don't invalidate it. Say, well, yeah, of course, your anxiety is saying stay safe, stay at home, stay close to mummy or stay close to daddy, don't go out, or don't go to school. But actually, that anxiety is doing its job, it's trying to keep you safe, but we can say, that's all right, anxiety, you can take a back seat now, chill. Okay, the grown-ups have got this and they're here to keep me safe. Anxiety, you don't have to keep me safe because I've got these grown-ups and so on. So yeah, try not to encourage avoidance in your child, because when you avoid your fears, the fears grow and get bigger and say, yep, you were right, you only feel safe by avoiding doing this thing, such as going into the classroom or leaving your parents. So all of what we've talked about so far is completely ordinary. And if any of what we've talked about, you think, oh yes, that's my child. Well, yeah, I'd expect that in as part of responding to an extraordinary experiences that we're all having this year. But if symptoms persist, if they become problematic, so if your child is getting so distressed that they don't do the ordinary things that they would normally do, such as go to school and separate from you and so on, it could be that they're starting to develop an anxiety disorder, okay? So every now and again, not wanting to go to school, every now and again, talking about how worried they are about what might happen about Christmas or an upcoming birthday or an event where maybe you would have more than 6 of you together. Okay, that's ordinary, but if it impacts on your child and they cannot function in a day-to-day way, it's really important that you seek some help. So certainly, probably at the moment it will be by telephone or Zoom, but certainly speak to school staff. So the SENCO is the Special Educational Needs Coordinator. Seek some advice from them. It could be that you speak to your GP, your general practitioner. I probably don't need to say that because you're all NHS workers or connected with the NHS. But yeah, certainly speak to your GP if you think actually this is getting quite problematic for my child. And there are some great guides available on the internet, in particular about worry, stress, anxiety, in particular in relation to the coronavirus. But it's really important that we look after our own mental health throughout all of this, because the other thing to say about anxiety, again, you probably intuitively know this, is it's very catching. It's highly contagious. So when we're parenting a child who's anxious, or when we're with a friend or a partner who's anxious, we sometimes kind of catch their anxiety. So it's really important we keep an eye on our own anxiety and we regulate that first, and then we attend to our child's anxiety. And you know that's the oxygen mask principle. Look after yourself first, and then you're in a better position to look after others. But some of these activities that I'm going to show you now, because it is half term, may actually help regulate your anxiety, because sometimes we forget doing playful, creative things are wonderful ways to help manage our anxiety. So create. If you're on half term, get creative. Don't put the recycling out. Junk modelling, use up things, make fun things. If your children's arty, encourage that. If they're not, doesn't matter, do something fun anyway. Again, lots of challenges online. You can use up old newspapers, etc. So So be creative. And if you do this alongside them, see what happens to your own anxiety when you engage in these sorts of things. You know, we're so busy being grown-ups and parents sometimes we forget that this is really good for our mental health too. And we're modeling to children how we can healthily cope with our anxiety. Dress up. So in little ones, this is about pretending to be someone else or something else. Be creative. You know, if you've gone through your wardrobe this year thinking, well, I'm not going to need to wear that again, or that's getting a bit tatty, you know, you've been doing lots of sorting, save some of those things for dress up materials. Your teenagers actually just do dressing up all the time. They're creative with makeup, hairstyles, trying on new ways. Use some time this half term to kind of, you know, engage in that a little bit. Can be great fun. Cooking. Brilliant because you get a meal at the end of it. Hopefully it's halfway edible as well. Great thing to do together. It means you're being creative. It means you're looking after yourself. It means you're doing something different with your hands. You can have great conversations with children as you cook together because it's less intense. You're less kind of faced each other. You're often sort of doing the chopping or the baking, whatever it is that you're doing, but something creative like cooking, dancing. What a brilliant stress and anxiety reliever. Having a dance is, so put the radio on or get them to find something on Spotify, have a good old dance. You can really shake things off. I know some parents have got busy on TikTok doing dance challenges and so on. But again, brilliant modelling to your child, just to be playful, have fun. And this goes into that kind of physical aspect of how we manage anxiety. Singing. It doesn't matter whether you can sing or not. The idea is that you can, it helps you regulate your breathing. It takes you somewhere else. It can get to a very different emotional part of you that perhaps needs a release. And I think, you know, people like Gareth Malone, who got that virtual choir going over lockdown, because, you know, we're not meant to be sort of singing a great deal with others at the moment, but it can be a great anxiety reliever. Put the radio on in the car, have a good old sing song. It'll drive your children a bit crazy, but then they'll do the same. Yeah, it can be great fun, real moments of connection when you sing and sing together. Stories, these can be wonderful ways, either where you actually think about anxiety. Some of you will be familiar with books such as The Huge Bag of Worries. That can be a great book where, you know, you're actually thinking about anxiety and how it's very ordinary to feel anxious, and we all have different things in our worry bags, and then at the end some of the worries get resolved. Or you can say, no, let's just have a story just for story's sake, where you just escape. You're in a different time, you're in a different place, you're in a different culture, you're animals, not humans, whatever it is. That can be a wonderful way to relieve yourself of your everyday worries. And getting outside, really, really important that you get a break, a bit of fresh air, a bit of space and running around time, and some nature. It can be so uplifting to have a bit of sun on your face, to walk, especially if you've got areas near you where the trees are turning and so on. Take pictures and just enjoy being outside together. Okay, we've come to the end of the kind of input bit, if you like, of me talking to you about anxiety. And I do hope that that was helpful and resonated with you and gave you some ideas about how you can help support your child at home. I think there's one thing in the chat I'm just going to have a look at. Let me see. Okay, so thank you very much, Chloe, because you put your name. I hope that's okay that I read this out to everyone. She said, thank you, it's really helpful. Great reminders for managing my own anxiety and that children in my care, as well as information and tips that were new to me. I think that's really key. So if you're going to take any one thing from this, I would say take Chloe's tip that, yeah, the most important thing is to manage your own anxiety, and then you'll be in a much better place to help support your child. So thank you for that reminder, Chloe. If anybody else wants to put anything in the chat or in the Q&A, okay, let's have a look. So I won't read out your names. You've mentioned your daughter. So a girl who's 14 associates breathing and mindfulness with being very anxious, so is reluctant to do this. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, that person who said that. Anything that brings about more anxiety, I think it's quite important to take things slowly and carefully. So in fact, if you bring your attention to your breath and that produces more anxiety, I wouldn't start there. For a lot of us, that instantly helps us calm and so on. So it could be for your daughter, you do something more physical to help regulate the breath. So going for a run, going for a bounce on the trampoline, that sort of thing, perhaps being more physical, where your breath will naturally get higher and higher and then lower and lower. That will give you the same idea that actually our minds and our bodies can help regulate the breath. But I understand, yeah, assuming that breathing exercises and mindfulness are good for all is not necessarily the case. There's a question about certificates and a question about availability of the webinar. I'm not too sure, but we do have Whitney, who from Place to Be, who has helped manage all of this morning. So I'm sure Whitney will be able to tell us about, I'm not sure about certificates, but it could be possible that the webinar is available, because I know it is being recorded. Okay, and I'll just go into the Q&A because there might be something there. How do you help another adult recognise their anxiety when they're not very self-aware? That's a great question. I think it's really useful to almost kind of model that self-awareness. So it could be that you talk about perhaps your own anxiety. Again, that can be done in a really everyday way. It doesn't have to be a big sort of, let's have this big chat, this big formal recognition. But you could just kind of say, oh, you know, about your day at work or your day with the kids or something that you did at the weekend, and say, oh, and I realised I started to get really anxious. Do you ever feel like that? Just get curious and invite them to comment perhaps on your anxiety and how it shows up for you. Because we all, you know, we tend to categorise ourselves, don't we? Like, oh, I'm a very anxious person, or I'm not a very anxious person, or I'm a confident person, or I'm this, I'm that. Actually, to be human means we experience everything to a greater or lesser degree. So it may be that for the adult that you're talking about, of course, they will experience anxiety, but for them, perhaps it shows up in another way and they don't realise that it is anxiety. So it could be that they present more in terms of, it shows up in disguised as anger, or it shows up in being a workaholic, or it shows up in, in some other way. So yeah, that might be my approach, that I would model being okay talking about anxiety. That's the other thing, you know, to be okay talking about mental health, to be okay talking about, oh, I felt really down this morning, so you know, and not to just leave it there, but to kind of talk about what you did to help yourself feel a little bit less down. And perhaps what you did was actually you just tolerated that feeling. You checked in with yourself at lunchtime, you thought, oh, still feel down, but just not quite as much maybe. And then by the end of the day, maybe you felt a bit better, or you actively did something to make yourself feel a bit better. You might have treated yourself, or connected with a friend, or watched something funny on TV, or just gone to bed with a good book, or whatever it is. So I think, yeah, always modelling ourselves before we expect something in return from others. That could be a good way. Thank you. That was a really, really great question. Okay. There's a question here as well. Is counselling helpful for older kids with anxiety? Certainly, the evidence suggests that when you have anxiety, one of the best forms of treatment is cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT. because we sort of really need to engage with anxiety and just let it know that it doesn't need to take over, it doesn't need to be so super efficient and super conscientious at keeping us safe and so on. And actually CBT gives some really great tools to help us really think about those 4 aspects of anxiety and how they show up for us. So those 4 aspects of anxiety I talked about earlier, so the thoughts, the feelings, the physical symptoms and our behaviour, actually that comes from a CBT model that just some counselling where you talk about anxiety and talk about anxiety and talk about anxiety may be less helpful. So CBT, where you kind of, you know, go for it, you really engage with anxiety in quite a sort of head-on way. Come on, let's do this. It's a real kind of rolling up your sleeves. So briefly, what is CBT? Oh gosh, I don't know whether I can answer that so briefly, the person who's asked that. So cognitive behavioural therapy usually is a fairly focused intervention. You might have between 6 or 8 sessions, say, and that you really target a particular aspect of your well-being. So we're talking about anxiety. So if you're working with a CBT therapist, they'd really focus on anxiety, how it shows up for you, how you would you know, like to work to help reduce some of those symptoms, just so you learn to live. So it's not about getting rid of anxiety, but you learn to live with how anxiety shows up for you so that it doesn't automatically jump in the driving seat and kind of take over or overwhelm you. Because, you know, we need anxiety for getting ready for exams, driving tests, first dates, all those sorts of things, going to school, separating from mummy and daddy. You know, anxiety has a really important function for us, but it's when it overwhelms and takes over and thinks it has to be in charge all the time, that's when it can get in the way. So CBT can help address that. Okay, it's 10 to 11, so I'm happy to do a couple more minutes if there are new, there are in the Q&A. What have we got here? Different things here. Oh, in the chat. Let's have a look. Oh, someone's very kindly put up a really helpful link. Yeah, the simple things matter, somebody said, which is really important. And yeah, there's the link, and actually I've clicked on it, I think, so I've taken you to that website around supporting your children's well-being. Yeah, thank you for putting that up, Chloe. Okay, if there's nothing else that anyone wants to ask or comment upon, thank you so much for coming today. I know it can be incredibly difficult, especially if you're on half term. That means you've got children in the house somewhere, but thank you for making the time. And yes, I appreciate your comments and your attendance, and take good care. Bye-bye.